spotlight from Spain.
Fraud is always going to exist. Now, in the future, in the present, it's just human nature.
It is perfectly clear that they've taken billions and billions from public coffers to make a small few very rich, while pretending they were stimulating the economy and growth.
The subsidies that political parties receive, and their subsidies, whatever you choose to call them, are normally outside the General Subsidy Act. This must be regulated by the European Parliament, that parliament we all pay for with our taxes. It's their obligation.
It's pretty hard for the public to have a critical spirit and to know the truth.
In Spain, practically all the institutions that have the objective of controlling public expenditure are institutions that function with very little efficacy.
That's the promise that's never kept by the parties that take power. When they're the opposition, they clamor for transparency. When they take power, they don't apply or finance the mechanisms that would allow that transparency.
Almost 420,000 results. Dummy corporations that only exist in order to snag public subsidies. Companies that misappropriate the funds they receive. The falsification of receipts to adapt them to the requisites for receiving aid. Possible frauds occur at all levels. Freelancers, co-ops, foundations, political parties, unions, companies. The goal of subsidies is to support the social and economic requirements of individuals and companies, both public and private, and above all, rationalize the economic system and favor reform. The subsidy model, however, is foundering due to an evident lack of control. The frauds committed by mining firms are famous. So are the supposedly fake receipts by the UGT in Andalusia, or the subsidies that are given to people that don't need them, such as what Brussels offers as part of its common agrarian policies. In spite of cutbacks due to the crisis, last year over 8 billion euros in subsidies were handed out, and Europe dedicated over 90 billion to various subsidies as well. This money comes from the taxes paid by the public, and in some cases doesn't get where it needs to go. To fight fraud, the government has included a number of modifications to the General Subsidy Act. Among them, the creation of a central database logging all the public funds dispersed so that any citizen may take a look. Experts on tax law have already called these changes a patch and criticized the political parties for not wanting to impose genuinely effective controls.
What's going on in Spain that there's so much fraud with public subsidies?
The controls are poor, low, and sometimes untimely, as for example the control over account courts, or that they're simply not exhaustive enough, and that mechanisms and processes are used that are not sufficiently stringent.
Why does this lack of control exist?
In Spain, practically all the institutions that have the objective of controlling public expenditure are institutions that function with very little efficacy.
Does the administration somehow facilitate fraud in public subsidies?
With the goal of avoiding certain controls, among them controlled by Europe, they use mechanisms and procedures in organisms or institutions they themselves create to avoid that control. That means that, in a way, they're facilitating it.
Could I myself be doing something right now to receive a subsidy and defraud the state?
You could make up proceedings to appear to comply with all the conditions required of a beneficiary of a subsidy and request one. With regard to this, we've seen the creation of procurers that actually invent proceedings in order to con the administration. Since the administration makes it easy by not establishing controls that are sufficiently rigorous, well, it's not that hard.
Does the problem exist when the money is given, or also throughout the process of adjudicating the money?
Right there. During that process is where a number of important checks should be established. Consider that many times, because the administration doesn't know enough, the private sector helps out. And perhaps during adjudication, people or entities from the private sector intervene as part of commissions to hand out grants. And later, they may also be beneficiaries of subsidies.
You're telling me that I can advise the government to have them give me the money?
To you yourself, I don't know.
Well, if I were a big company.
Well, yes, there have been cases where we've detected that specific problem.
Recently we learned of a fraud totaling 600 million euros that occurred within grants given to the coal sector, to mining. How is a 600 million euro fraud possible?
Logically, similar frauds can only be carried out by those that receive massive amounts of money. So, the subsidies that go to specific sectors are the ones that receive large volumes. Just there, for example, the electricity sector, you might find this with gas, with all those that receive large subsidies, because they're the largest subsidies there are, the ones that help specific sectors.
Are there many swindlers in jail? Is this punished a lot?
I don't know of any. There are a few cases.
If we compare ourselves with other European nations, with regard to regulations, we're above the curve. But with fraud?
The level of fraud is high. It's not something incidental. It's something that happens, and we'd have to have an iron will to change it. Just look at the political parties. We have a big problem. Often, those that create the law exclude themselves. Why? The subsidies that political parties receive, and their subsidies, whatever you choose to call them, are normally outside the General Subsidy Act.
For years, the European Union, the central government, and the regional government of Andalusia have subsidized the training of workers in that region. Last year, however, alarms went off. A large part of that money never made it to where it needed to be.
What happened is that the money was given to certain companies, to management and unions, specifically UGT. And what seems to have happened is that the payment for specific items were billed to other things that had nothing to do with the subsidy and were costs that the union should have paid for, which the government of Andalusia was being billed. Money travels quickly, and the normal modus operandi was for the government to give companies 75% of the subsidy, and afterward, once that 75% was justified, they would give the remaining 25% of the total subsidy. Some business people simply didn't give certain courses because they knew local government couldn't audit every course given, because they didn't have sufficient inspectors, and it seems those courses weren't given. After that, since controls in place couldn't confirm those courses had been given, that 25% wasn't justified. But the firms returned for the next bid. Why? There were also exonerations.
The investigation of the supposed misdirection of public funds was a part of Operation Sirene, focused on the alleged slush fund of UGT Andalusia, in which there have been 14 detained, as well as of Operation Edu, dealing with companies in Andalusia that supposedly misdirected funds that were to have gone to training the unemployed. A complex investigation that's still ongoing.
How extensive is the fraud? Well, at this point in time in the investigation, because there are many processes open, we can't determine the scope. According to the indications from the police, the fraud has extended to all provinces and has taken multiple forms. There were business people that didn't justify subsidies, union funds that were spending the money on other things.
Insufficient controls, a lack of personnel, and a lack of morals, the possible ingredients of a fraud that has come to light.
What has happened and what's being said, well, it should all come to light and be dealt with officially, so that we can avoid any mistakes that would be fairly harmful to society, not just for Andalusia, but also for the sum of all Spanish society.
It's true that the indications up to now reveal there were insufficient controls. Right now, it seems that the situation has changed or is changing a bit. Public servants are more conscious of the fact, well, public servants and political leaders are more conscious of the fact that the management of public funds requires a certain level of responsibility that's very high. Each document must be reviewed. Fraud is always going to exist. Now, in the future. In the present, it's just human nature. Based on that, all controls possible are insufficient. It's very easy to say we have to watch everything, but who's going to pay for those inspectors? To what point can inspectors oversee everything and be 100% on top of cases? That's a political decision that's hard to make.
Are there myths or hoaxes related to renewable energy with regard to the money received by the government?
Of course. The electric companies have, through media channels, tried to instill in the public the mantra that renewable energies are too expensive, and that during this phase of dire economic crisis, we simply can't afford them.
Could renewable energies exist without incentives?
Second-generation renewables, current ones, use technologies that are mature, like solar power or wind power, and can compete with fossil fuels. The problem is that legislation impedes that new renewable energies develop without public aid.
The state, in its last reform of the energy sector, tried or is trying to eliminate incentives or subsidies to renewable energies. Why is that?
Because they're at the beck and call of large energy companies. Here, the only thing that's of interest is for things to be more and more expensive.
What does your group prefer? Keep the incentives or have good legislation in order to be independent of the state?
That there be good legislation, of course. And I have absolutely no problem with the state investing. But what we can't have is a perversion of the subsidy system in general, or an assault on the people that trusted in the state to make their investments, or that believed it is necessary to change the energy model to pollute less.
In the last 15 years, renewable energies have received 52 billion euros. Was this money spent in vain?
It's the best investment we've made as a country. For the first time, the Spanish state was a pioneer in a technological sector. Our technologies and engineers were fought over in technologically powerful countries. We missed that train, lost that opportunity. We lost a lot of jobs, and we lost our common sense.
In some cases, when someone invested in renewable energies, there was a 10% profit. Isn't this excessive?
The first people that supported renewables 10 years ago, without having a history behind it, without knowing if things would work or not, had bargain costs. They could have invested in other systems or other sectors. That has to be compensated.
Did avarice break the bank?
No. Bad planning and conniving between political and economic powers created this disaster. The only problem we have now is that current legislation de-incentivizes the new development of renewable energies without public funds. It's madness.
If you don't mind, I'll ask you what energies receive subsidies. Coal?
Coal receives subsidies, yes.
Natural gas?
Absolutely. And you have to note that these are subsidies that are very subtle. For example, payment per capacity. There are thermal plants that receive cash just for existing, and now we have payments for hibernation, which are plants that have decided to close because they're not profitable because they're at 11% of their capacity. These are private investments, and will have to pay for it, all the consumers of the electric and gas system.
Why don't people recall that nuclear plants were built and launched with government money?
They don't recall that, and they don't recall hundreds of other things related to the energy system, or that are generally mad because they don't appear in the news. It's pretty hard for the public to have a critical spirit and to know the truth. This produces a certain disconnection, because you really don't know anything about the energy system. You don't worry about it, and you let others decide for you. The thing is, those others are large corporations that are only interested in a balance sheet.
On his 100 hectares of fields in Lebrija, Juan grows cotton, beets, tomatoes, corn, and grains. Now he's in the middle of gathering tomatoes, but without common agricultural subsidies, his work would be unsustainable.
The aid that the PAC gives is essential. Without it, things would be impossible. The prices we'd get for produce would be the same prices as 30 years ago. So if we didn't receive that small bit of aid, it would be really hard to work in the country.
The new PACs establish a linear disbursement that doesn't give incentives to professional farmers.
After 2015, when new PAC reforms come into play, all us farmers will be on unemployment aid. It depends on the hectares you have. If you have 12 hectares, you get 10 or 12,000 euros. If you have 20 or 100, well, the more you have, the more you get. Where's the problem? The small farms, family farms that are the fundamental axis of society, the axis of agriculture. They're making them disappear. Only big farms will get aid. The latifundia, the ones that have 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hectares that don't even have their accounts managed in Andalusia. We all get the same, no matter whether you're growing tomatoes or beets or cotton or any social crops that generate a lot of work and a lot of business, or whether you're a guy that has a farm with 10 hares and 14 boars.
These are so-called armchair farmers.
An armchair farmer has a farm of 1,000 or 1,500 hectares with maybe 4 fields that he never even goes to see. And what he does is he stays on the couch. He never goes out. And he picks up his pack for the year.
The list of beneficiaries of this aid is public and includes big brands such as Nestle and Mercadona, construction firms, royal families such as the House of Alba.
One of the biggest sources of income for the administration comes from the PAC. It comes from the PAC. They have such little shame, the indecency to build airports with public money, and now they're taking public aid that's being shared by a bunch of mates.
The real goal of subsidies is to support farmers so they'll offer high-quality produce and keep a population in rural areas. That this objective is in danger is, according to Juan, motivated by politics.
How can you tell me you'll give me money not to produce? It's absurd. You give me money to produce, and further, to produce a high-quality product. I'll use that public money, which doesn't belong to politicians. It's public money that belongs to everyone, and I'll use it to grow high-quality produce. The responsibility to regulate this lies with the European Parliament, that parliament we all pay with for our taxes. It's their obligation. But this isn't a question of obligations due to politics. They know that Duchess of Alba is the person who receives the most aid in Spain. Mario Conde, all this stuff with airports, they know it all. It's all logged with their national ID card. They know. Since there's no political will to change anything, whatever we say is meaningless.
When a union receives subsidies from the state, doesn't it limit that union when it comes time to fighting with that state, to carry out actions to defend workers?
The unions don't fight against the state. They fight in favor of workers. So everything that's in favor of workers should be considered in favor of a democratic state, of rights and well-being.
Is it really like this? Is this premise being met?
Well, sure. If what you're saying is they're giving money, not the state, but a specific government or leader, with conditions that serve the interests of that party in power, which is how things are often done, then of course, no, that's not it.
Are subsidies necessary for the management of foundations like political organizations or parties or unions?
Well, they become necessary due to the lack of public culture, of political culture, of democratic culture. Contributions from militant members aren't enough to finance them, so they have to resort to other tricks, all of them. And that's what deteriorates the quality of democracy and creates political corruption.
But for example, the PP received 24.5 million euros and the PSOE 14 million euros in subsidies for the parties, apart from the salaries their leaders earn. Is this actually insufficient, or is there a lot of greed?
It's obvious there's greed. If a treasurer takes 32 million euros to Switzerland, obviously there's no subsidy big enough to finance that.
How is it possible that with all these organizations like foundations, parties, unions, there is fraud?
The laws have been designed such that it's impossible to control those foundations, those subsidies, or the movement of money.
So, with regard to aid, specifically subsidies, to the industrial sector, there are aid packages given with the goal of supporting tourism, but really, it's doubtful whether that gets to the public.
What's happened is that those that have taken power again and again throughout the democratic era have considered their reason for being there to benefit their clan, their friends, their caste. They have dedicated themselves to privatizing companies. This phenomenon has led to subsidies continuing to arrive at those privatized companies. Public money has continued to cover up the problems with those companies, but solely to the benefit of a few.
So this is done with the goal of making business people rich?
Of course. It is perfectly clear that they've taken billions and billions from public coffers to make a small few very rich, while pretending they were stimulating the economy and growth.
The average person, the man on the street, often thinks that money is given to someone exploiting the system, not a Spanish worker. Someone who obtains money due thanks to a pretty face, to coin a phrase. Is there political demagogy when this argument is used to attack citizens or make them squabble?
Of course, yes. They use speech to inflame them. If we want to make workers in Andalusia fight workers in Catalonia, or those in Extremadura with Valencia, it's a very clear and simple and demagogical way to have those workers lose confidence in unions that are trying to unify their struggle, or parties that are trying to represent them, or put money into those movements that would help them weather difficulties.
Is more transparency needed with subsidies? Do things need to be more clear and defined?
That's the promise that's never kept by the parties that take power. When they're the opposition, they clamor for transparency. When they take power, they don't apply or finance the mechanisms that would allow that transparency.
Spotlight from Spain.